Um, and there's the cue that we're recording now, and can be found at the bottom of our homepage. So just a little bit more about Jeff and Matt. So Jeff is the Director of Security.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, got some background there. Jeff is the Director of Security for the Molson Coors Beverage Company. Jeff has 18 years of experience in law enforcement in the security industry, in addition to 8 years in retail management and human resource fields. Jeff received his certification in emergency management, planning, and administration in 2014, and is a certified protection professional, and he got that certification in 2019. Matthew Doherty is nationally recognized for his work in violence prevention and threat assessment and management. As managing director of the SICH Workforce Risk Management Team, he helps organizations build and expand violence prevention programs. Matt retired from a 21-year career with the United States Secret Service as the U.S. Secret Service Special Agent in charge of the National Threat Assessment Center. So be on your best behavior. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt to get us started on this topic today.
Thank you for having us. Jeff Mueller and I have a long-standing relationship as we provided training that he'll talk about. This really strategy for workplace violence prevention is so relevant, as you know, in the media, which I'm interviewed constantly. And I just can't emphasize enough, it's a rare honor for someone like Jeff and his company to come forward with lessons learned from a tragic incident that they had. I've been in this business, as Brianna mentioned, 14 years in the private sector and 22 years in the Secret Service for threat assessment. And this is, again, just a rare opportunity. So I want to kick it off to Jeff and talk about his experiences on an incident that he had personal interaction with.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And thank you for having me today. This is something that, as Matt's heard me say a few times now, but this is something that I enjoy talking about, not only if it's something that I can share some knowledge to help others kind of protect their field, but for me, it keeps it front of mind for me. I think that we're, as a society, we're so quick to forget and move on. And we need to keep this front of mind, at least for me, as I continue on my career with Molson Coors Beverage Company, to make sure that everything we're doing, every decision we make is kind of run through the lens of this has happened and can we, is this going to help maybe prevent something in the future? So thank you again for having me. Am I going to take over turning the slides or there? Yeah. Oh, there we want to go to the map. There we go. Next one, I think. There we go. So for those that aren't familiar with the Milwaukee Brewery, it's been there for almost 200 years. It is a collection of original buildings and new buildings. Some of those buildings are about 180 years old, and some of those buildings are less than 2 years old. This is, to give it a little bit of perspective here. This is about a mile, 3/4 of a mile square box, right, in each direction. It's a collection of 83 buildings now on 80 plus acres of land. As I mentioned, some of the buildings are original, some are new, and they were built right next to each other. So it's, you could be on the third floor of one building and literally walk down a hallway and you're on the second floor or first floor of another building, depending which direction you go. So it is, it's a hard place to get around. And again, from a perspective standpoint, you can see kind of a large road going through the middle of your map. That's State Street in Milwaukee, which is a fairly large thoroughfare for the city of Milwaukee. It divides our campus in half. So we don't have a defined perimeter, right? We have public sidewalks. We have lots of traffic. It's when in a critical incident, trying to navigate first responders to a location. That little red dot that you see on the map, that's where we were trying to get first responders to go to in this big convoluted group of buildings. And each one of those buildings has their own address. And then, of course, if you've been here for 20 plus years, it as one name, the building that is as one name. If you've been here for 10 years, you know it as a different name. And if you've been here for less than 5, you have a third name that you know it as. So it can be very difficult navigating first responders into a situation like this. If you will go to the next slide. So just kind of a brief overview of what happened on February 26th at the end of shift. Our assailant was sitting in a break room with a couple other employees. The first indication we had that anything was amiss was when our assailant placed a phone call to his child's school to arrange for after school care. Folks thought that was a little strange. Normally he was it was very urgent to him to get out of work on time so he could go pick up his child. And that was the first and really only indication that day that something wasn't normal. Our assailant then leaves the break room area. From this point until the last victim is really the best we can piece together based on the investigation that we ran, the investigation the police ran, because there was only one survivor, and there were no notes left. There were no type of manifest or a reason given. But what we believe happened was the assailant went to a work area that he had. It was not a private work area, but he was one of the only people that worked in that space. We believe he retrieved his firearms. He then went up to what would be considered the third floor of the building. And our first victim was sitting in an office with his back to the door, was shot in the back and never saw it coming. Our second victim was in the hallway outside that office, confronted our assailant. There was a struggle that occurred. We know this because of an injury that our assailant sustained, and the fact that his primary weapon, which was a silenced handgun, had malfunctioned. And he then retrieved a secondary weapon where he shot and killed our second victim. He then went down the stairs back towards the break room where he started. On the stairs, he confronted a third victim, which is where that individual was shot and killed. He then goes into what we refer to as a control room, which is just inside this door where you see the arrow, right? So again, going back to what I said at the beginning, trying to navigate first responders to where we need them to be, beyond the big collection of buildings. We're trying to navigate them to this door, which is in a courtyard off of, State Street, which is that big street that I identified on the previous screen. So he enters into the control room. He shoots and kills the person who was operating the controls at that time in the control room. There were two people sitting in the break room. This is the break room where this all started, where he was sitting prior to going to retrieve his weapons. Those folks that were sitting in there, those two individuals, heard the sound of gunfire. They wisely did not go through the door into the control room, but rather went through a different door where they could see through a window into the control room, where they saw our assailant standing over the deceased body of his fourth victim. The assailant looks at the two of them, makes some type of a motion like, no, you guys are okay. When he does that, our fifth victim runs one direction. Our one and only survivor stands there and waits. As soon as our fifth victim ran, our assailant mirrors his actions and goes out into the hallway where our fifth victim was trying to flee. He shoots our fifth victim in the back as he's trying to escape, and he dies at that scene, at that spot. Our one survivor, seeing which direction the assailant went, chose to go the opposite direction. He made it outside into this courtyard area that you see here. And that was our first call and our first indication that we knew anything was happening. He gets into this courtyard. He calls 911. He activates notifies security. He then goes back into the building to an area different direction than he last saw the assailant going, and manages to get a few more folks out of the building. Thankfully, the day this happened, the Milwaukee Police Department was doing some training just down the street. And, if you look at police response to critical incidents, I've seen anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes, upwards of 12 to 15 minutes, depending on, where you're talking about, what your law enforcement presence looks like. They responded. Our first officers were on scene in a minute and a half from the initial 911 call, thanks to their proximity to the facility, which is just a phenomenal response. It is my belief, and the belief of a few others who were doing the investigation, that this is the reason that the incident ended as quickly as it did, because we believe the assailant heard the sirens, which would have been coming down the street just outside of the room where he was, where he shot his last victim. Our assailant then made his way back towards that initial room where I said he went to, his work area, and took his own life. His body was found at the base of the stairs leading to that workspace. If you want to go to the next slide, Matt. The reason why we do this, and I say we want to keep, I like talking about this to keep it front of mind. These 5 individuals lost their lives that day. And if there's anything I can do for the company to make sure I keep this front of mind and make decisions to prevent having to lose folks again in the future, or anything I can offer to this group or any group to help them prevent, these 5 individuals are the reason we do that. To be fair, there's a 6th individual who lost his life that I believe related to this event 2 days later. We have a first responder group at our brewery in Milwaukee that responds to medical calls. This first responder responded to the victim on the stairs and rendered aid. He was still alive when the first responder got there. Unfortunately, he perished before the first responder did all he could. Certainly medical staff did all they could. That first responder, whether intentional or accidental, had an overdose 2 days later and passed away. So there's a 6th victim, and that kind of plays in a little bit to the some of what we're going to talk about with some of the mental health need in these types of events. We can go to the next slide. So what did we know leading up to the event? There's some different color-coded things on here, and the reason this is color-coded is because this is information that different groups knew, right, by color. So the first part of it here is kind of widely accepted knowledge, right? In 2015, our assailant had a workers' comp injury, claim, shoulder injury, had a couple of surgeries. The insurance company was fighting the claim for a while, but ultimately ended up paying out on the claim. So it was all covered. Well, our assailant, in 2017, 2018, this is our first signs of paranoia. And this is information that his family had, right? Friends, family, those that were really close to him. He started talking about paranoid activity, right? He thought people were breaking into his house, spying on him, accessing his iPad. They were drugging him to knock him out so they could use his fingerprint to get on his iPad. Even so much like going to an Applebee's, he thought the waitress at the Applebee's had slipped something into his food so that they could, somehow get him to pass out and access his phone and his iPad, sorry. The family thought that was pretty strange, right? But this kind of then goes into to 2018. He puts in cameras inside of his house, which with what the family was seeing from him saying, of this being spied on and being followed and being drugged, and then the cameras inside, they were kind of on the edge of, boy, this is probably not okay. We should probably call someone. However, as fate would have it, 3 weeks after he installed the cameras inside the house, they were having some plumbing work done, and the cameras caught the plumber stealing from the house. And so what the family was chalking up as some real paranoid behavior now made him look like he was pretty smart, right? Because, hey, he put these cameras in, we caught this theft from happening. And so it kind of lowered their level of alertness. Late in 2018, and this is color coded differently because this is the only time the company had any insight into some of the paranoid thoughts that our assailant was having. He makes a complaint to HR that he's being followed. His complaint is that the person following him is from the insurance company that handled the workers' comp complaint. He thinks they're spying in, trying to catch him, doing something he shouldn't be doing because of the workers' comp, right? Because of the surgery and the injury complaint. Talks about the poisoning so people can access his phone and his iPad. HR wisely reaches out to security, and we look at it and say, well, we should probably talk to him and see what's going on, right? And so we make every effort over the next few weeks to get him to meet with us so we can talk through some of his concerns, all about trying to help him. He's interacting with us back and forth by email, but he never actually agrees to meet with us to sit down and talk. After about 3 weeks goes by, he sends an email saying, look, I'm good. Everything's fine. I was mistaken. I'm not being followed. I don't need any help. I appreciate you guys' concern for me, but I'm okay. And this is one of those areas that, people ask if we would do anything differently, hindsight. And, this is one of those, we didn't have a full piece, or we didn't have a full pie, right? We had a piece of the pie. And we look at this, and if there's anything that I would have done differently, anything that we would have done differently as an organization, it probably would have been to try to, we can't obviously compel that interview, but it would have been more to try to maybe engage, mental health resources or a group, like Matt and his team to try to have that conversation and maybe take a look at what's happening and see if is there anything more there that we can do or should do, or anything we do to get this gentleman some help. Would it have made a difference? I don't know for sure. But when I look at, is there anything else we could have done? That's probably the one piece that, maybe we could have done more with that. So then we go into 2019. And in 2019, this is law enforcement knew this. The family didn't know this. Work didn't know this. In 2019, he goes to the FBI, their local office here, and he makes a complaint to the FBI. Same thing that we'd all heard before, right? Same thing he told his family, same thing he told work. He's now telling to the FBI. And I'm not casting any shade towards the FBI. I mean, they did everything that they should do. They followed all their procedures. They get a lot of these types of things every day, and they've got to make a threat assessment, and they made their threat assessment, and there was really no follow-up action for them to take, right? Again, they only had one piece of the pie. They didn't know about this pattern that had been building over the last 5 years. 2019 is really kind of that last piece of the paranoid activity we saw, and that's where he installs camera on the exterior of his house. Now, again, we go back. This is something the family knew. Work didn't know this. Police didn't know this. The family knew that he was putting cameras up outside his house, and certainly they had seen the paranoid activity before. But you had the interior cameras caught the plumber stealing, and this is a time where society, or at least in the U.S., right, cameras were so cheap and easy. You could buy them off the shelf at Costco for $100, or buy them on Amazon for $50 and put them up with really no trouble. And so everyone was putting cameras outside their house, and so that really didn't heighten the family's alert level too much. That's all we knew, right? That is all of the indicators that this gentleman might be suffering from something that needs a higher level of support. I go over this just to let everyone know that, you might see something from an employee, from someone in the public, someone you interact with. You might see something that you think is really strange and odd, but not know it's the tip of the iceberg. You don't know who else is seeing stuff. And so I would just encourage you to, when you get those little threads, to really pull on that thread and do everything you can to try to make sure it's not a bigger iceberg than what you're seeing, because you may not have that whole pie. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So we had, at the time this incident happened, just gone through a big reorganization. In June of 2019, I took over as director of security for the company. In October of 2019, we announced a plan to reorganize the company. In January of 2020, we enact that plan. So very, very short timeline. That plan included the layoffs of over 400 people. We closed a couple of corporate offices, consolidated to 2 corporate offices, really just trying to run more efficiently. But it was a turbulent time for folks, because we took what was really a collection of 4 companies and made them one company. And a lot of moving parts, a lot of trying to do some hazard identification, right? And do we need to put different levels of support at different offices? In late January of 2020, we are up in Canada for what would be our first leadership team meeting of the newly formed company. We then come back and go to one of our big conferences in February of 2020, which is actually where we were when this incident happened. And this is all relevant because we have a crisis management team and really a collection of leaders at the company at this time in February of 2020, who are, many of which, new to role. They've never been in that crisis management type of position before. They've never had to deal with a critical incident before. And everyone was so new into role, we hadn't had a chance to do any training, right? I mean, so when you look at kind of the perfect storm of bad things happening, we were in the middle of it, because we had this very critical incident, February 26th, that happens at one of our corporate locations. Our corporate office is attached to the Milwaukee Brewery, and all of our leadership team is new to role and in Texas at a conference when this happens. We had every reason to fail, and our CEO, Gavin Hattersley, who I can't say enough positive about, he took the approach from the moment this happened that everything we do in response to this is going to be putting our people first. There are all kinds of business decisions that need to be made, right? How long can we not operate in there because it's a crime scene? How long do we keep it closed because it's just right for our people, because our people aren't ready to come back? What do we tell our investors? What do we tell our suppliers? How do we go back to trying to make beer and get it, in the hands of the consumers? All of these financial decisions need to be made. All of these really big decisions that impact on a global scale for us. In every decision we made, every single decision, Gavin made it clear was going to be through the lens of what's right for our people first, which really I think is why we succeeded. The very first thing we did, we're flying back from Texas, and we, while I was we got a chartered plane, private plane. So there's 7 of us on this plane coming back, myself, CEO, our chief supply chain officer, comms, a couple of those key folks that needed to be back. And on the plane, I'm making calls trying to get people set up for critical incident stress debriefing. So this is something that from my law enforcement days, at least in the state of Wisconsin, we had started putting a lot of effort towards critical incident stress debriefing for our first responders, recognizing that they're going into these horrific scenes, dealing with these horrific things, and that takes a toll because they're not able to process as a victim. They are victims, but they're not able to process that way because they're responding. They're the help. They're ones to normalize the scene. And so having these immediate critical incident stress debriefings to take those first responders and give them that opportunity to know to look, you're going to go through this. You're going to feel this. It's okay. It's normal. Here's some skills to help you cope with it. So on the way back, I'm arranging for a critical incident stress debriefer to meet us at the facility. The incident started at 2:00 in the afternoon, give or take a few minutes. And it was over within really 5 minutes. The police response was much longer as they're searching the facility, but the police released the scene. I shouldn't say released the scene, but they finished clearing the facility by about 6:30 that evening. We had those of us that were coming from Texas on that plane were back on property by 7. So we got back pretty quick. First thing we did when we got on site, before we met with the police, before we met with anyone to find out what was happening, was we went and gathered those responders from our team. The police were handling their folks. Those responders from our team, those security people that had to be in role and do their job to help get, our people to a safe place. The brewery leaders who were in Milwaukee, who were trying to account for the people and make sure that they were giving all the support to law enforcement they could. It was 8 people. I pulled them all of them off of what they were doing. I put them in a room, said, look, you don't have to talk. You don't have to share. You can sit there and listen. You can sit there and stare at a wall. I want you to be in here for the next 10 minutes and hear what this gentleman has to say. If you want to talk to him further, we'll arrange that time for you to do that. But I want you to just take 10 minutes for yourself. And so we did that. We pulled everyone off of what they were doing. We put them in that room and we gave them that tool for their toolbox, right? So at least we were trying to take care of them. We then did all of the stuff with the police department that you would expect. We go into our crisis meetings and we're talking about what's right for our people. Best intentions, sent everybody home. We closed all of our facilities in the US. We closed. The incident happened in Milwaukee. The victims weren't just in Milwaukee. I had people who felt victimized because it was at the company. It was similar to what they do. It could easily happen at their facility. It was just too close to home for folks. And so we had people as far away as Fraser Valley, which is in Chilliwack, British Columbia, who were victimized by this. But we sent everyone home. We said, look, we're shutting down. Go be with your families. Go be with your loved ones. Go to your religious preference, right? Go take care of yourself, which was, I think, the best intentioned move, but probably something we would have done slightly differently going forward. That works great for those that have a good family support structure, a good friend support structure, a good religious support structure. It worked well for those folks. But what we didn't take into account was those folks who don't have a family structure, who don't, they live by themselves. They don't have, that good support group at home. Maybe they're not religious or not overly religious where they felt like it was comfortable doing that. And so, hindsight again, right? What would we do differently? It was the right move to shut down, but creating an opportunity for folks, and this usually makes folks cry when I mention this, but we don't get to sell all the beer we make. We actually have to dump some of it sometimes, which is really a sad moment. But, taking just a mindless job that doesn't require a lot of quality control and just giving an opportunity for folks, look, if you want to be here, here's a place you can be, right? That gives you some purpose, gives you something to do, maybe gives you a chance to be around that support structure from work that you're closer with than folks outside of work, right? And it's not about meeting a quota of how much beer you can dump in an hour. It's about being someplace. And you know what? If you dump 1 can in 8 hours, fine, that's okay, right? It just gives them that place that they feel most comfortable to kind of process what they've gone through. The reopening, we kept our U.S. breweries all started back up after 24 hours. Milwaukee specifically did not. We, again, through the mindset of what's putting our people first, we made the decision to keep the Milwaukee Brewery closed until we could make it look like something didn't happen. Is probably the best way for me to put it. I mean, certainly there's broken doors, windows, that you're going to have to order, right? Try as hard as you want. You can't go buy a door or a window for a 180-year-old building and expect it to fit if you're going to Home Depot. It's just not going to work. So there's things you have to special order, you have to make. And so certainly there's lead time on those, and not all of those repairs were done. But, from a biohazard cleanup, from a, police going through and marking walls, which is what the police do, right? They're going to go through a big building, and they've got, ways to mark walls to let people know rooms are clear or not clear, or whatever they've done as they've gone through it. So we made it a point to go through the brewery before we let anyone back in, because we didn't want to re-victimize them. We made the financial decision, really, is what it comes down to. I mean, it's about putting our people first, but it's a financial implication to keep that brewery closed until we could make it look like stuff didn't happen inside. We cleaned all the walls, we repainted the walls, areas of the brewery where, we have a red paint we use to mark, like where, walking areas, safe walk areas. Well, sometimes they get a little sloppy when they're painting and paint gets splashed on the walls, and to somebody who's, maybe experienced at rendering medical aid, yeah, it doesn't look like blood. But to somebody who is not used to rendering aid, who's not used to seeing that kind of thing, and they see a red splatter on the wall, it takes them back to that day. And so we repainted all of that, and we made sure that there were none of those splatters. And we really took a lot of care to make it look like something didn't happen. That space, that control room that I talked about, where the fourth victim lost his life, that entire room was redone, and not more so than just what had to be done because, of cleanup. We changed the ceilings, the walls, the floors, we changed the furniture, we tried to make it look like an entirely new and different space because we didn't want to re-victimize our folks. When we did bring them back, we brought them back. Our first shift back was a third shift, and we did this for every shift. We have an area that we call the stables. It's a big meeting area. It's really what it is. And we announced to everyone that, hey, we're coming back to work. You need to show up to work at your normal time. And what we did though was we didn't produce one drop of beer. What we did was we put everyone in the room and we talked. We were together. The CEO was there, the leadership team was there, and we talked through what we had all experienced. We talked through how we were gonna get to the new normal. We had a ton of mental health support there. And it's important when you look at the mental health support. EAP is a great thing, right? And it certainly serves its place. But you need to recognize that EAP is not necessarily your best option for a critical incident, right? Whether you're talking about a threat identification going forward, threat identification before it happens, where you want to engage mental health professionals like Matt and his team to identify that type of stuff. But even going after, EAP is great for some of those daily work struggles, but a really critical, violent, tragic incident like this is just not in their wheelhouse. It's not what they deal with every day. And then you've got your selection of your population, and I've seen it at every company I've been at, every job I've had. You get a certain population that just doesn't trust EAP for whatever reason, right? It's a branch of management. They're going to go back and tell management that I'm struggling with something. And so the resource is only as good as, someone's willingness to use it. So we made it a point to not only have EAP there, but we reached out to our local Red Cross, and we had their critical incident stress debrief team, which is used for first responders, right, in the Milwaukee area. It's made up of fire department, police department, paramedics. These are people who understand what you're going through after a tragic event. They can speak to it because they've experienced it firsthand. They aren't viewed as an extension of the company. And we had much more usage of that Red Cross team, that critical incident stress debriefing team, than we did of our EAP team. Certainly had EAP there too, because some people were more comfortable with that. And that's great, right? Because again, it's about what you're willing to use, right? If you're not willing to use it, you're not willing to listen to it, it's not doing anything for you. So having that option is there for them. And then we had options of groups. We had option for individual. We brought in the therapy dogs, which people love. We bring the therapy dogs back every year, I think, at this point. But it is something that you need to have those resources for what's going to be right for the individual, because everyone's going to grieve in their own way, right? Everyone's going to recover at their own pace. Not everyone's going to be ready to have that conversation with the mental health professional to talk about what they've gone through, the day of, or 2 days later, or a week later. When we talk about that perfect storm earlier, this happened in February 26th of 2020. Well, COVID was happening in February of 2020. And it was a week after this incident that we shut down our corporate offices for COVID. So go home, work from home, right? And so when I talk about that own pace, right, people recover at their own pace. We had a situation where, because of the length of COVID, right, we all sent everyone home for like 3 weeks. And, a year and a half, 2 years later, we brought them back. And so we had people that were coming back, a year and a half later, that it was the first time they walked into the building since the day of the shooting. And so we had mental health support, people that were still grieving and going through that process, a year and a half later, because they hadn't been back in that situation, right? So it's really important to understand that you need to have the right resources set up, and resources, that a variety of resources, right, that people are willing to use. And Matt, I kind of touched a little bit on some of the kind of the I don't know if you wanted to add anything into that, but I think it's important, to recognize that if you're going to using like an EAP or something for a threat identification early on, that's not your best option.
That's correct. EAP, we applaud those programs, and I'll talk about in a few minutes how we evaluate and develop workplace violence prevention policies and programs. But EAP is a wonderful program for those variety of societal issues: debt consolidation, divorce, depression, untreated mental health, all of those types of issues. But it's important to realize that EAP are not trained in violent risk assessment. We have on our staff licensed forensic psychologists that are trained in those areas. And again, EAP is typically not trained in violent risk assessment or threat assessment processes.
Yeah. Excuse me. If we can go to the next slide, I'll go over this one pretty quick. So it's just kind of a few takeaways that don't necessarily have to do with that kind of that putting people first mentality, but being able to communicate effectively and quickly. We use a program called Everbridge. There's a bunch out there that you can use, but being able to relay those messages to folks, to let them know what's going on. Everbridge is, we basically send out a page for those that aren't familiar with it to people's, however they want to get it, right? Cell phone, it can be a text, phone call, email. It can go to multiple paths, communication paths. But it's just a way for us to communicate with folks, not only to let them know to get out of harm's way, but to give them status updates throughout the incident, right? Because that's going to reduce the anxiety of folks. It was also a way for us to do some accountability, because Everbridge has a response feature built into it, right? So we were able to, in an incident like this, as you can imagine, right, people are going to go and run and evacuate. It's very chaotic. And so we were able to send out those messages through Everbridge, and we were sending them out hours after the event was done, just asking folks to confirm that they were in a safe location. You're right. So that accountability piece that, kind of ties in with the communication, but that's a huge piece to make sure that you have established for your organization. The clear and accurate information. I mean, it's anyone that's had to deal with a critical incident before, anyone that's had any experience as a first responder and in law enforcement in some way. The information that you get initially is always wrong. Usually the second and third reports are a little more accurate, but still wrong. And so just understanding that, you want to have as much intel as you can, whether that's through relationships with your first responders. I was texting with our local police captain right through the incident, trying to get information, relaying on news, relaying on some of that open source intel, the social media type things, right? Having those set up so you can get some of that intel coming in. You can kind of look through all that intel and piece together, okay, this is a common theme. This one's probably fairly accurate. And hey, this one seems odd. We should probably look into this one a little bit to see the accuracy of that one. But trying to get that clear and accurate information, and the establishing a relationship with the first responders can help with that. But the other part of it is get them into your facility early, right? Get them walking through, get them familiar with it. Do some things to kind of help them navigate should they have to respond to something like this. We had, I think, every law enforcement agency within an hour of our facility was represented that day because of the size of the facility, right? Just teams to clear and do the law enforcement things that they need to do. And so folks that never thought they would respond to something in the city of Milwaukee were here responding. And so trying to get things in place to make that response as easy as possible for folks that might be their first time walking through. Good maps, good signage, good nomenclature for facilities. And then the other thing goes back to that people first, right? The very last bullet point I have in this one. Our approach towards security prior to this incident was by facility, right? Milwaukee had a higher level of security because of where it is. It's in a challenging neighborhood that has experienced some issues over the years. But it had a different level of security than, for say, a facility in Albany, Georgia, that's in the middle of nowhere, right? You don't have that same close proximity of the neighborhood and the streets driving through the brewery. So we did security differently based upon the facility. And the change in mentality here was putting people first, right? Doing security based on what's right for the person, not what's right for the building. And so if it's right for us to do it in Milwaukee, well, then it's right for us to do it at our other facilities as well, too, because the reality is although it happened in Milwaukee, could have happened at any one of our facilities in any country, in any state, in any province, in any city. And so putting those things in place to make sure that everyone has an equal level of protection is vitally important as well, too. So if we go to the next slide, this is probably the biggest area of opportunity I think there always is, right, is that training and awareness. And this is where Matt and his team really came in. We have a threat response team, right, that evaluates these type of workplace concerns and provides direction, a multidisciplinary team, right? It's HR, it's legal, it's security, ethics, compliance, and then there's some ad hoc members as well, too. Developing training, right, that Matt and his team came in and did for us, but then continuing that, right? It's not a one and done, but continuing to have that training and staying on top of trends and staying on top of new concepts of how to respond and address these types of things, and implementing the early intervention type pieces, right? Having that resource there, right? I talked a lot about having the mental health resources available when it happens and in the days, weeks, months after. But it's become part of our culture now. Everything we do, we have mental health resources available. We have a mental health resource on staff now in Milwaukee. We have, if there's stuff happening, not necessarily at work, but happening in the community that we think might create some stress for folks, we do a big a big push, communication push on mental health resources and a variety of options, right? Because what's right for one is not right for the next. And so we do that as part of our culture now. We talk about, we talk about the fact that it's okay to talk about mental health stress, right? Being affected by mental health stressors in life does not mean that you have a diagnosable mental health problem. It just means that you're human. And we're trying to create that space where folks are comfortable talking about it and willing to talk about it. And then providing that ongoing training, right? Whether it's the threat response team, where you're doing that ongoing training, like I said, it's not a one and done, but also that ongoing training for our people, for our employees, for even all the way down to our sanitation folks, right? Making sure that they understand how to recognize those signs and what their communication path is to report that if they do see it, and really breaking down the stigma of reporting that it's not snitching, or it's not, you're not getting someone in trouble. It's trying to get them help, right? The only way to prevent this from happening is early intervention, right? We need to get in there early when the person is starting to feel these stressors. They're starting to deal with these stressors and they don't know how to deal with it. That's where you can affect the change. And so getting folks comfortable reporting, recognizing and reporting that. I can't say enough about how important that is. But yeah, if you want to go to the next slide, I think, Matt, if you want to talk a little bit more about some of that ongoing training.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And again, feel free to ask questions during this chat, and we welcome that. Jeff's navigation of this situation was nothing short of miraculous. We have consulted with a lot of clients that have experienced this, and some of them have not recovered. But I want to emphasize the behavioral threat assessment piece. Oftentimes we go into companies and as we develop their programs and policies, we come across employee handbooks with a one-sentence word about workplace violence, which is workplace violence won't be tolerated. And that just doesn't cover prevention of violence in the workplace. Jeff and I are both members of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and we also follow those Society of Human Resource Standards and OSHA guidelines on implementing these programs. But there's a big difference between zero tolerance policies, where I'm sure if you saw a fight in the lobby of your facility or somebody directly threatened a coworker or supervisor, that would be dealt with immediately, or overt blatant sexual harassment. But really what threat assessment is, and I've explained this to the media over and over again, I have a media interview tonight regarding the shooting in Texas, but you really need that capability of determining whether people have the interest, motivation, or intent and capability of committing an act of targeted violence. It's not a punitive program, workplace violence prevention in your companies. It's not simply assessing whether a threat was made. We trained Jeff's team, their interdisciplinary team, and stress that over and over again. You're not there to determine whether a direct threat was made, but you're really trying to proactively address behaviors of concern and to mitigate an escalation of violence. And Jeff has admirably talked about mental health issues. And it's important to talk about untreated mental health, because most mentally ill people in our society today are law-abiding citizens. And there's no doubt in your demographics that we have a friend, loved one, ourselves dealing with issues. What we're talking about is untreated mental health and how to identify those warning signs and red flags of behavior. Next slide. So typically, when you develop a program, and obviously Jeff's leadership is a great example of that, when you're developing a workplace violence prevention program, and we realize people have their day jobs, but companies are remiss if they don't have a program, but securing that leadership buy-in, which obviously Jeff does from his CEO on down. But the way to develop a program, we strongly feel that policies are developed by leadership, workplace violence prevention policies regarding domestic violence or untreated mental health, red flags, warning signs. The policies are developed by leadership in collaboration with a company such as ours. The program is the responsibility of everyone in the company. But we come in and do a comprehensive needs assessment following human resource management guidelines and OSHA But we come in and do a needs assessment, looking at all the relevant policies. For instance, is there any mention of restraining orders in an employee handbook to voluntarily bring those forward? When you hear that 40% of women killed in the workplace are killed by an intimate partner, that needs to be addressed as a non-punitive program, but a wellness program of courtesy, respect, and safety in the workplace. At that point, when we conduct a needs assessment, we expand and develop programs. How do you keep track of cases? Have a discussion with legal and security and HR, because everyone should have some type of interdisciplinary process. Jeff's company is a great example of that. HR, legal, and security talk every day. There's a lot of company cultures where security is relegated to the parking lot or the outer perimeter and rarely interacts with HR on concerning employees. And that is a recipe for failure. So we developed those programs, developed the protocols and resources available, such as the psychological forensic psychologists that we have on staff. We conduct their safe termination policies, safe suspension policies that should be followed, particularly those that are concerning employees. Next slide. So, after you align those policies, establish those reporting options. We firmly believe that anonymous hotlines should be fully leveraged. I'm sure most of you in the manufacturing sector that you are have some type of ethics and compliance with the products that you developed, but we like to leverage those anonymous hotlines. Some people are not comfortable reporting their coworker as being a possible victim of domestic abuse, or reporting their supervisor of displaying some untreated mental illness, warning signs, etc. And you need a centralized case management system, but not to be conflated with employee evaluations, because these cases come and go. And a case management system can address different categories. Is it a customer? Is it a visitor? Is it a coworker? And is it a family member, as I cited that domestic violence statistic? And then you need to train that threat management team. And you can call it whatever you want to call it. Some company cultures call it a care team, crisis action response. But there has to be an interdisciplinary process where cases of concern rise to the level where HR, legal can conduct that inquiry and or assessment. Jeff alluded to the FBI, perhaps, and again, no shot on any heroic actions by the police departments, but where they did not connect the dots. Every company should have some type of process where they're consulting with each other. Security may have some type of information coming out of what they're aware of, and HR could be aware of something in their personnel file, and legal may be aware of something as benign as a tax lien against somebody or the brand protection. And you really need to have ready access to threat assessment experts. Again, we consult on suspension cases, termination cases. Some of them are very serious, where we conduct maybe perhaps a surveillance. One example is somebody was terminated for concerning behavior, disruptive behavior, anger management, etc. We looked at that person's open source social media and found that they took a selfie in front of the boss's house that terminated them. That's a very concerning behavior of ours. Notice that we're not there to determine whether a threat was made. Threats in the workplace should be taken very seriously, but don't conflate the two, that the mere absence of a direct threat. You really need to look at those concerning behaviors. And then you need to implement that enterprise-wide training. Again, the program, we feel, is the responsibility of every employee, which is your most valuable asset. So every employee should be aware of the non-punitive nature of the program. You're not there to get somebody in trouble, but if you have concerns about a fellow employee or visitor or customer or family member visiting the workplace, that's not a punitive program. We're there to help you and bring that information forward, so that people like in Jeff's position can take those proactive steps proactive, non-punitive steps to ensure a safe workplace. We do believe that the entire workforce should be trained. Managers should be trained in de-escalation. It can be either uploaded to a learning management system, done virtually, or in person. And we conduct that on a weekly basis with many of our clients. And we have a large array of clients that we work with. Next slide. And again, there is an economic argument when we do develop programs. Where's the investment? Prevention. Nobody can predict violence, and we can get into that when we conduct training. But reacting, it's 100 times more expensive. The expense and cost that Jeff has implemented, proactively so, courageously so. Prevention is really the key, and it's a much better return on investment to take some nominal time out of your budget and to make sure there's a workplace violence prevention program and policies in place that can prevent these things, hopefully, potentially prevent these things from happening in the first place. Next one. So again, we've worked with many clients post-incident where employee retention and morale, what you don't want is a bad review on Indeed or Glassdoor that it's not a safe place to work. It definitely enhances that workplace culture and climate to know that it's not a punitive program. It really is somebody exhibiting signs of being a victim of domestic abuse and bringing that forward discreetly, privately, perhaps looking at a restraining order to be expanded to the workplace as an example. It really creates a culture and climate. We found that each and every time we get involved with clients and when we announce the program. And look at all that's happening with targeted violence in the media. When you do things like a survey, implement a program, provide the training, we found it in each and every case, culture and climate are enhanced in a company because it shows you care. You get an increased reporting of disruptive and concerning behavior, as well as red flags. We did provide training for Jeff and his teams, and it caused some very constructive conversations about perhaps concerning employees that should be brought to the attention of companies earlier. And it really is all about early intervention. Nobody can predict violence, as I said, but before problems escalate. And sometimes the problem, as we all know with the experience in this group, that it perhaps can be the employee themselves or the supervisor. And it does provide for greater business continuity and resilience to have that program in place and reducing risk of lawsuits and settlements. Even the police have announced to all of their, and Texas, I'll be interviewed tonight, and that's an exception. Police would much rather respond and participate in any threat assessment team process through liaison with people such as Jeff when they're concerned, when Jeff's concerned about somebody, as opposed to responding to an incident. So it does reduce the risk of lawsuits and settlements. More often than not, we do see, and how often have you seen it in the media, where coworkers come out and they're interviewed and say, we've always been concerned about that person, but nobody did anything about it. So it does reduce that risk of lawsuits. Next slide. So again, it's providing SICH at Workforce Risk Management. We've always been on the cutting edge of HR advisory services. And this is just one level of circle of support. We have on our staff, again, forensic psychologists, open source intelligence, which is really, you're so looking at people's social media when needed, or monitoring persons of concern, but conducting that needs assessment, developing a program, having a capability of threat management, even if it's outsourced, but having that preferably internal expertise and providing that training and awareness is really the key to your success in a program. And for those people that don't have these programs, they're really playing roulette with this. More and more companies are adapting those OSHA guidelines and Society of Human Resource Management standards. Jeff and I will be in California at the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals in August, where it really is a cutting edge of even law enforcement now is getting it. Huge difference between an investigation for law enforcement where you're looking for evidence of a crime, and threat assessment where you're trying to prevent. And those are the things we're trying to hit home. If there's any questions on the chat room at this point, Jeff and I would most welcome those questions. I do have a couple of questions myself as we get on with this.
I guess while we're waiting for the questions to come in, I just want to kind of back up something you said there, Matt, when you talked about employee retention. We've, even with some of the things we put in place and the way we've addressed it, we've certainly have seen some folks that have left just for the plain fact that even with all the things we put in, because of what happened, they just don't feel safe. And so that is a real fact, right? I mean, that's something that we can attest to, that it truly does. That perception of safety absolutely aids in retention and recruitment.
Absolutely. And I'm just curious, does anybody out here want to volunteer? Do you have threat assessment team processes in place or workplace violence prevention programs in place, other than that kind of zero tolerance policy, which even human resource management is starting to get away from, because they realize just zero tolerance for fighting or a direct threat or sexual harassment, although those should not be tolerated, they should be dealt with, but that does not address those issues such as being a victim of domestic abuse or untreated mental health. Anybody have programs out there that they'd like to share? Or not? I would hope that people, I'm wondering what kind of training is out there among your clients. I'm sure there's sexual harassment training, those types of things, HR, perhaps de-escalation or how to manage difficult situations. We also look at safe termination best practices, especially a termination where the behavior is of concern. We have some best practices as far as severance packages where it's tied into the person's behavior. You can't come back to the company, interact. I do see a chat. Brianna, if someone could read that off, I just saw it flash up for a second.
The question is for a facility that has just a handful of staff, maybe 5. The threat may be more from a stranger coming onto the property or entering the building. What would you recommend for assessing the risk, and what kind of experts could we consult? Possibly interested in training and awareness. So talk a little more about how we would go about that.
Yeah, I think to do training and awareness, what are the warning signs of red flag behaviors? And that's why we follow Department of Labor guidelines to keep track of those types of cases. It could, again, different categories of people: visitor, customer, family member, or coworker. And so when you get somebody coming in, how to de-escalate a situation, what are the warning signs of behavior? I'm sure they would call the police if somebody shows up, with a gun threatening to kill everybody. But frankly, rarely do these cases, as Jeff well knows, are they preceded by a direct threat. So the training would involve, what are the warning signs? What are the red flag behaviors? How do you report them? And how do you keep track of those cases? Not that you would have a lot of volume with just five employees at a site, but these cases can come and go. It can be an innocuous visitor that was kind of an odd visit, but that should be documented for the next time that they come in. Do you liaison with local law enforcement? Law enforcement, if I called them 12 years ago and asked them to participate in a threat assessment, if needed, they really weren't interested, frankly. They don't get involved in HR matters. They are now getting it. When Jeff and I go to that ATAC conference, I would say about half the audience is current law enforcement, sworn law enforcement, educating themselves and getting the latest on threat assessment. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, if I could just kind of add to it a little bit, I agree everything Matt said, right? But when you're talking about that unknown, that stranger, coming onto property, this is where I think it's important to have kind of protection in depth, right? You've got an outer perimeter, you've got an inner perimeter, and that could be as simple as, the outer perimeter is a fence or a locked door, and the inner perimeter is maybe after you get, past that initial hallway, the doors and the access to the rest of the facility are locked. And so it does it does create that opportunity to respond, right? So if they go through the first door, is it accidental? Is it intentional, right? Are they looking for their customer contact, their client contact, or are they there for nefarious reasons? It gives that ability to kind of assess that in the moment. But then also for your employees, creating situational awareness, and that goes on to that ongoing training. I frequently get asked, about doing active assailant drills, right? When are we going to do an active assailant drill? And my response is always as simple as, we've been practicing how to walk out of a building since we were 5. I don't need to show you how to do that, right? What I need you to do is create that situational awareness. And it applies to active shooter. It applies to, recognizing the signs in advance of a potential threat. And it applies to really any type of hazard, right? The stranger coming off the street, or the door that's propped open that isn't normally propped open. It's creating that situational awareness. And so what I tell folks is that you want to do some type of training that's going to benefit not only for active assailant, but just creating that situational awareness. It takes 2 people in a place. That's it. You don't need to have any other planning. You don't need to have any other, those tabletop exercises and full scale exercises are all wonderful, wonderful learning opportunities, but it's not practical to do them on a daily basis. If you have 2 people in a place, it's as simple as one of them asking the other one, hey, something happened right now. What would you do? In this place where you are at this moment, where maybe you sit every day, or maybe this is the first time you've been in this place for the last 6 months, an office, a conference room, a line where you're, running a bottling machine, right? Or whatever that place is. What would you do if something happened right now? Where would you hide? Where is there a place for you to hide? Can you barricade the door? Can you lock the light? Can you turn the lights off? Can you lock the door? If you're going to run, where are your exits? Do you know how to get out of here? The main exit you came in might not be available. Do you know where the other exits are? If you're in a mall, do you know that if you go through any store through the back door, you're going to be in a hallway that's got about an exit door into the parking lot every 20 feet? It's just kind of, it gets folks out of their rut of, I'm going to wake up every day. I'm going to have my eggs. I'm going to grab my coffee. I'm going to drive the same route to work. I'm going to park in the same spot. I'm going to sit in the same chair in the conference room. I'm going to, it gets them out of that routine and causes them to start looking and noticing things that maybe they didn't look at or notice in the past. And so not only from a response to an active assailant, but they start paying attention to, hey, you know what? I know that door is an alternate exit for me and it's always locked. I never see it open. I should probably let someone know, right? Or I look at this area every day when I'm walking up, and I don't ever remember seeing that person hanging out in that section of the parking lot or walking on that section of the sidewalk, or it gets folks thinking and recognizing their environment, which then you're going to start being able to do some early intervention to protect your folks.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jeff. You're spot on. When we conduct active assailant training, it's all about situational awareness. Take a break on that lunch period, and where does that stairway go, just in case you needed it. The time to think about it is now, rather than to panic. Those that panic and don't have that situational awareness, oftentimes in studies of active shooter incidents, of which we conducted one after Virginia Beach, where 11 people were killed. Those people that survived were those that made sound decisions for thinking about this in advance, as opposed to, oh my God, what do I do now? Where do I go? Where does that stairway go? And that situational awareness just comes back to me. One of an anecdote, we oftentimes include receptionists and office managers as part of the needs assessment process. And we had one receptionist, it was a food supply chain, and she buzzes in people she knows, typically. She buzzed in one employee. They didn't have termination practices or procedures set. She buzzed him in. She said, "Hey, Joe, how you doing?" She knew him, just assumed he forgot his pass. And he goes, "Well, I was fired yesterday. I'm going to see some people." And he was very angry. And if somebody had just let her know on a termination, not the details of the termination, but this person's a do not admit now, she would never have buzzed him in. And it potentially could have had disastrous consequences. So those types of things on security awareness are just key in that training and awareness. Not turning in somebody, some of the signs of domestic abuse are wearing excessive makeup, hiding bruises, and men aren't exempt from being a victim of domestic abuse, but frankly, the statistics for women are just horrendous. But wearing excessive makeup to hide bruises, or appears to be living in the car out in the parking lot, those types of things, not to get the person in trouble, because it is against most state labor laws not to discriminate against somebody for merely being a victim of domestic abuse, but getting care and concern. And it really goes over well with the general employees to get that situational awareness and training. Any other questions that we have or discussions?
Two questions. The first one's a follow-up to your statement. Could you speak a little bit more about how reporting a concern is not a violation of privacy? And address that for those that are unsure about how that works.
Absolutely. When we train threat management teams, we look at, and that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. Oftentimes in the past, threat management teams or interdisciplinary crisis management teams at companies, sometimes, and not accusatory, but HR may hold on to the information because they say, oh, it could be a HIPAA violation, or there's an expectation of privacy. Your behavior at work, there are public safety exceptions to both HIPAA, which is health privacy, mental health treatment, and there are public safety exceptions to FERPA. If you happen to have interns on the job and it's an academic exercise, your grades, your performance, there are public safety exceptions to sharing that information. And that's why when we train management and the interdisciplinary team that everyone should have, we teach those public safety exceptions, because your behavior is not part of your performance evaluation. Your concerning behaviors, untreated mental health, those types of things really has nothing to do with your performance. Just like somebody being a victim of domestic abuse, that has nothing to do with that person's performance, judgment, all of those things. So you break down those barriers and share information. It's critically important that legal is aware of those public safety exceptions so that you do and can share information. Jeff probably on a weekly basis, he and his staff are liaisoning with law enforcement, and they're aware of those public safety exceptions, what needs to be shared with law enforcement, what they can share, has the authorization of his company and the endorsement of his company. So too often times there's been incidents because people didn't want to share the information, and that's a huge mistake. You have to be aware of those public safety exceptions.
One other question that's a follow-up to the initial question about having a small staff. Could you speak to the opportunity to train or do a needs assessment for a small company and a large company? Is that something that's scalable, or talk a little bit more about how that works?
Sure, it's definitely scalable. Let me go to the large scale first, because I realize our targeted audience here perhaps is on a smaller scale. Sometimes we'll go into a large Fortune 50 company that's had 3 mergers and acquisitions. So the policies and programs are all over the place. Well, that's scalable. That's a little more cost, a little more involved, a lot more level of effort to get one coherent policy. If we go into a company that's of a much smaller scale, and perhaps they don't have workplace violence prevention policies other than, zero tolerance policies for direct threat and sexual harassment, your traditional policies, that's much more scalable. Especially the smaller the company, the less policies they have, frankly, the easier it is for us to develop those policies. But all of them have to be customized. We have to have the nomenclature right for the company. What could work for one company in similar size might not work for another company, because the culture, the company mission, the nomenclature might be different. So really the first step is that needs assessment. Let's see what you have, but it's definitely scalable according to the size and scope of a company.
Yeah, and I would just add on to what I was saying earlier when I said we do what's right for the person and not the facility. Now, when we look at our security, that is still scalable, right? I mean, not all of our facilities are the size of a golden brewery that stretches 3 miles and is the largest brewery in North America. Not all of them are that big, right? Some of them have smaller staff. I have a facility that has five people working at it, right? It's looking at the concept for the person, right? What's right to protect this person, and then how do we make that work for that smaller facility, right? I don't, if you go to a Milwaukee, I might have a guard staff of 60 people that are serving a purpose, because that's the number of people needed to meet that concept of security for that person. I go to a smaller site and right, they might not have a guard, but what do we have in place instead? We put virtual things in place that give them kind of that same protection, and that still that ability to get a hold of someone. It's just one example, right? But from even how you deploy it, it is scalable as long as you have the concept of what are we trying to do? We're trying to protect employee A from this. How do we do that at each site, right? So it is, the stuff that Matt's talking about, and even how you deploy your more physical security pieces is all completely scalable.
Yeah, and nuances of the training. I mean, that de-escalation, that's just critical. Managers, coworkers, when you have a visitor in, or manager and subordinate, we've seen situations where managers actually have a concerning situation with an employee, and they're inadvertently escalating the situation as opposed to how do we de-escalate. So de-escalation training is a critical point with that scenario that someone just brought up with the 5 people. How do you de-escalate a situation with a customer, visitor, guest, family member, or coworker?
I have a,
Go ahead, Brianna.
I was just gonna say, one thing that we did yesterday with our staff in a staff meeting and in preparation discussing this webinar, I mentioned in a staff meeting, I said, in the preparation for this webinar, Matt mentioned that, we're a smaller organization, I think most of but Matt mentioned that having an in-out board that's visible to the public is a huge safety concern. Especially, thinking about anyone who might have a restraining order, but that the person who the restraining order is on knows where you work. So we had a little bit of a discussion by that, and I noticed maybe less than an hour after our staff meeting, someone had already moved the in-out board. And so that was just something that we never really thought of. And so just wanted to share that lesson learned with everyone else as well. I also wanted to just take a minute to, when we started advertising for this session, one of our members and a participant who's on the call on the webinar today reached out to me and just said, hey, there's active shooter insurance that's available. Not a lot of people know about it. And so, his goal is to just he wants more people to be aware that it's a possibility. Obviously, prevention is the first step. Excuse me, but John, I don't know if you wanted to mention anything else about the fact that insurance is available, but just wanted to pass that message along as well.
Sure, I'll mention a few things. Thank you. Brianna said when this came out, I saw this and sent her some information about companies we know that actually insure this type of, or make this insurance available. It wasn't until a few years ago, honestly, that our clients started asking about it. So we started digging in and doing some research. There's a lot of different companies out there that have different programs. You really have to go to what's called an excess and surplus market. And those companies then put together programs for something like this through like Lloyd's of London. So it's such a new coverage that it's really hard to figure out which ones are good and which ones are not. So a few years ago, we started putting together, looking at all the programs and putting the pros and cons. That's what's covered, what's not covered. So I did pass along some information. So my suggestion here is when you meet with your insurance, doing your annual review with your agent, your advisor, just ask them what you're covered for and what you're not covered for, because it's good to know what's available out there. Some of the active shooter coverage that they do have provide additional things that your general liability wouldn't. They do public relations, they help with counseling, funeral expenses, help for rehabilitation expenses. Those are things that are not covered under your general liability policy. So there happens to be one that I found, and I am in no way associated with them, but one I've been recommending our clients is actually a group based out of here in Cleveland, Ohio. They're national. It's McGowan Group. They have an active shooter program. It's one of the best ones that I've seen out there. The cost is somewhat reasonable. And I will give you the link to it in the chat. And what I would do is any of your insurance advisors can go through McGowan. It's not a something where you have to be appointed with them. They can reach out to them and ask them more information. But I would definitely make sure that when you're doing your annual reviews that you consider that.
Thanks so much, John, for sharing that information. And I'll see any other final questions. We might have time for one more before we need to move into wrap up.
I do have one additional question. I've had the opportunity to hear Matt speak before, as well as Jeff. And, at the very beginning, you mentioned engaging mental health resources. We all know that it's tough to get mental health resources on board quickly. Matt, one of the things that you spoke about, though, was and I can't recall the name of it, but something that you were able to get in place during a threat assessment or a person of interest. Was like a 3-day hold. Could you talk about some of those things that are available in a situation where you do have a concern, outside of just let's get them some mental health help?
Yeah, that's one of the services we provide in that threat management piece that you see on this circle of support. We have trained licensed forensic psychologists and trained people. I spent 35 years in this threat assessment field, where we do an initial intake. If somebody has a concern about a visitor, customer, family member, coworker, to call us and do what we call an initial intake. It's not a blank check to go back to the person's history for the last 40 years, but we'll take a look at what are their behaviors, perhaps do what we call a TLO, do a records check to see if there's any criminal record out there, restraining orders, tax liens, those types of life stressors, and then take a look at their open source intelligence, perfectly legal to do that. Take a look at their open source intelligence, and then get back to the client, to the company, and let them know our preliminary findings and make some recommendations for next steps, as opposed to a long-term analysis that takes 2-week turnaround time. Typically in just a couple days, we get back on the phone, or that night if it's a really important and exigent. But we do that, and again, we're not trying to determine whether a threat was made. We're trying to determine intent, motivation, or capability of committing any violent acts. That's what we're there to determine. So that behavioral threat assessment process is very nuanced, much different than a criminal investigation or an HR violation of a zero tolerance policy. Happy to help with that, Laura, and I can't thank you enough. Laura is our conduit here for this group. If anybody has any further questions or would like to enlist our services. But I hope that answered your question, Laura, about our behavioral threat assessment process.
And if I could just add into that, right? I mean, again, everything Matt said is perfect, right? But also for having that mental health available for maybe those folks that are at your facilities who are dealing with something and have that moment of maybe they are willing to reach out for help before it gets to that level. Knowing that your first line supervisors, your HR folks, your whoever are going to be interacting with them understand the resources that are available through the company, right? Whether it's EAP or other, but beyond that, know what's available in the community, right? At all of our facilities now, we have our staff trained and ready with what's available in this community for different groups, right? Veterans groups or different ethnic groups or different, religious groups, right? What different counseling or mental health services are there for somebody who is maybe dealing with some of those stressors and has that moment where they're willing to accept help, which could be a very short, finite moment. But if you're able to at least get them connected with someone at that time and not have to give them the, hey, I'm glad you came to me, I'll see what I can find, and then have to remember to follow up with them in the next 2-3 days, that window of them willing to accept that help may have closed, right? So just having your folks ready and aware of what's available.
And we're, thanks for that, Jeff. I don't want anybody to think that we don't endorse EAP programs. Those are to be applauded. As a matter of fact, when we do a needs assessment, we look at whether, usually it's outsourced EAP programs, and we're very familiar, have a personal relationship with some of the nationally recognized EAP programs. We even look at the number of referrals. We know it's private, but we'll ask HR. Usually the EAP can supply the number of referrals in the different categories of cases. And we've gone into very large companies where the referrals were minimal. Well, that's a vulnerability for workplace violence. If your EAP program, according to your demographics, is not robustly utilized, especially coming out of the pandemic, right, with all the issues that are coming out of there, then that's a vulnerability for workplace violence. So in no way does our behavioral threat assessment capability, which EAP does not have, is any indication that EAP should not be utilized and robustly leveraged in an organization.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I mean, EAP is one of those resources that we all know about and we tend to rely upon as, do you have mental health resources? Yes, we have EAP. That's a tool, right? Just make sure what I'm saying is have multiple tools. That's but yeah, right. Absolutely, EAP is great.
Wonderful. Well, Jeff, I want to personally thank you. So sorry that you had to go through that, but I'm so thankful that you're willing to share your experience and help others learn from your tragedy. Matt, you're a wealth of knowledge as well. I want to thank you as well. And Laura, I have to give a shout out to you too for getting this whole thing started and bringing us all together so that we could have this webinar and hopefully our members can utilize the resources that you all provide around this topic as well. So thank you all for attending. Some next steps, action items are, we always love to hear your feedback, so please feel free to share that. Also, you can either reach out to us at Manufacturing Works or directly to Sikich if you have their contact information, if you want to learn more about how you can work with Matt on your own company. There's also John Horvath put the insurance link in the chat as well, if that's something you want to look into. And if you ever have any other needs or want to learn more about this topic or others, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, this was recorded, so you'll be able to go back and access it if you want to show it to others or just revisit the conversation in general. I thank you all for your time today. Wonderful, timely topic. And I will see you all hopefully soon in the future. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.